Okay, folks, hope you're doing well. Well, I wanted to focus on something kind of interesting is why there's been such a skyrocket in the culture wars in only the past 10 or 11 years. Now, there's always been things, problems, some tensions, but never to this degree have we ever seen. I've never seen it like this in my lifetime. So, we know that there's the usual suspects here. We have the usual suspects, which are the powers that be that are fueling these culture wars to divide and pit human beings against one another. Well, what does that do? Dividing people against one another and fueling things artificially, not organically. What does that benefit the powers that be? Say bankers, say government entities. Well, division is a way to leverage power. When you're in powerful positions, this is a fantastic way to entitle yourself with power, is by keeping people divided against one another. And then they ignore what you're doing all the time. They ignore the fact that you're doing probably pretty bad things, probably, and worse off for everybody. That's the thing. We've had things in the past like the lead in the water in Flint, Michigan. Well, everybody who lives in Flint, black, white, lesbian, whatever, you're all affected by it. That be know this. They don't like you. They don't like any of you. It doesn't matter. No matter what moral compass or moral superiority they kind of play or morality they exhibit, what they exhibit on the surface, it really is all virtue signaling because they haven't done anything. Everybody's still drinking lead there. If you're lesbian, you're drinking water with lead in it. If you're gay, you're drinking water with lead in it. If you're black, you're still drinking water with lead in it. If you're white, you're drinking water with lead in it in Flint, Michigan. And so it kind of indicates that there's actually a war. Simply a war against people. But I wanted to show you that the culture war itself, before I digress, the culture war itself basically spawned and skyrocketed starting in about 2012, 2013. And we have the metrics. We know we have suspicions who the usual suspects are. In fact, we have evidence now, thanks to the Twitter files. But now we actually have metrics on this. And I was so glad somebody did a deep dive. So Kaneko the Great on Twitter did a deep dive on this. And he said, number one here, okay, look at the increase of news articles mentioning white privilege, systemic racism, diversity and inclusion, and unconscious bias. How does the media's focus on identity politics and critical race theory contribute to the division and polarization of society? Well, it seems to be a lot. Mind you, though, this is not organic. These metrics will show you this was artificially fueled and planned deliberately by the powers that be. Includes like the media, government entities, and I would say like bankers, Wall Street. Okay, and I'll show you how. But first, let's look at this. So in this first chart, we're not going to look at every single chart because eventually, after a while, you'll get the gist. They all kind of have that same pattern, that hockey stick pattern. See, like the stick here, and then you've got down here the whatever. I'm not even into hockey, so I don't know. But that's a hockey stick pattern. So this is what you hit, the area you hit the puck with, and then the stick up here. Sorry, Canadians, about that. But I do love to watch hockey. I just don't know what that part's called. Anyway, so it's a hockey stick. So here's the first one. And on the left here, it shows the number of articles, 0 to about 2,500. And then on the bottom of the chart, on that axis, it says 1975 to about now, okay? Generally about 2020, 2021, I think is where this kind of ends in most of them. So you can see it just flat lines throughout from the 70s all the way out through the 90s. It takes a little bit of, there's a bit of an increase to maybe, I'd say maybe 100 or 150 in 1998. And then it kind of goes down a bit and it steadies off a little higher to 2005. Some movement here, stays under 500 number of news articles with the term white privilege. And then suddenly we see this massive skyrocket in 2012. Okay, so you're looking at maybe 200 articles, 250 articles, and there's a skyrocket to the next year to all the way to, you're looking at maybe 750 articles. And then the year after that, it jumps up to almost maybe 1,200 or 1,300 articles. And then you get above 2,000 in the next year. And by 2015, you're above 2,500 articles. This is an anomaly right here. Here, let me turn on this. Okay, so show you my cursor. This is an anomaly. Now, as obviously as you can see, just using your eyes, you don't have to be an expert or a statistician. And mind you, I will tell you, this comes from LexisNexis. Okay, so Kaneko did a deep dive using the LexisNexis search engine, which is like a research engine that's used at most universities. At least when I was at school, that was the major search engine for media, articles, periodicals, magazines. But I mean, it has everything. So you could research all those articles. And if you're not in college, I think you usually have to like pay for it to even use it. So anyway, it's pretty comprehensive. And you can see here, it says number of articles. Let's see, let's go down to this one. Number of news articles, the one below it. Number of news articles mentioning diversity and inclusion. Okay, and that skyrockets. This chart starts in about 1990. I think that's where they started tracking this, where this was actually first mentioned as a phrase. And then you can see it skyrockets in about 2012. It just jumps straight up. And then by the time we get it to 2017, this is the number of news articles mentioning diversity inclusion has reached above 15,000. That's a freaking lot of articles. And you can see the same up here. Let's go here. Oh, okay. You can see the same here. It skyrockets here with the use of the term systemic racism, and then the term unconscious bias, same pattern here. So where there's like a percentage, number of all articles that mention unconscious bias, it skyrockets to from basically before 2012, maybe there was like a couple hundred. And then all of a sudden, by the time you get to 2016, 2017, there's at least 6,000 articles. And that, I mean, that's a huge jump. So you can obviously, you get the gist. And we've got things like, look at the number of articles mentioning whiteness, intersectionality, critical race theory, and diversity training. Whiteness, that jumps up. It makes a steady climb kind of throughout the 90s, early 2000s. Then it just skyrockets when you get to where? The usual suspect, 2012, 2013. Intersectionality, that became a thing in about 2012, 2013 right there, and makes a huge jump. Number of articles goes from about essentially 0, maybe a 10, to over probably about 1,700 right there. 1,600 or 1,700 articles. That's just in a few years. And diversity training, things like that. You can see the patterns are generally the same. And then he says, look at the increase in the number of New York Times articles mentioning discrimination, social justice, people of color, and racism. So again, we can see this starts in, let's see, let's go over here. This starts in 2012. Okay. This starts in 2012 and jumps, I mean, skyrockets in the New York Times, because who is going to put out these articles first? If it's inorganic and somebody's being paid or funded to do this, to push this, well, of course, the New York Times is going to lead the way. Them and the Washington Post will lead the way because they know all other outlets will follow. Okay, they'll follow their lead. And the New York Times, they had a number of articles mentioning discrimination in 2011 and 12 was like maybe 700, and it skyrockets all the way. By the time you get to 2015, it skyrockets to nearly 2,500 articles. And racism, of course, the word of the century, I swear, the most abused and watered down word in the world at this point because it's so overly used for everything. You can see in about 2012, it sits there, not too bad, and then it jumps all from like 2014, and it jumps all the way to almost 2,500 articles in the New York Times itself alone mentioning racism, whereas before then it may have been like down to like 400 or 300. That's a lot, okay? And so let's go down a little bit. You can see the same thing, same terms, diversity, similar terms, police brutality, transgender. Police brutality became very popular suddenly. 2012, 2013, 2014, 2013 right there, and then it makes a huge jump from maybe 50 articles possibly, looks like about 50, a little less, and it makes a huge jump within just like 3 years to over 400 articles just in the New York Times alone mentioning police brutality. And so I'm not going to go through every graph, but I think you're getting the gist. See, like here, this is just these different colors here, these represent just different newspapers using these terms. And he says, between 2011 and 2019, the New York Times and Washington Post increased their usage of the words racist, racists, and racism by over 700% and nearly 1,000% respectively. And you can see there, see New York Times is in blue. They all jump in about 2012. Washington Post jumps, that's in green. Los Angeles Times, that makes a bit of a jump. And yellow is a Wall Street Journal, who's a little more tame on that type of stuff, since they're more focused on financial stuff, but they're going to still fuel that. And people like this chart right here says, how big of a problem is racism in the U.S. today? Is it a big problem, somewhat of a problem, a small problem, or not a problem at all? Percent is big problem. And you can see here like white liberals, it goes down in 2010 and it jumps up in 2020 to a little over 80% that think it's a big problem. Okay, and you've got white moderates in green here. Sorry, I should have described that. In blue is the white liberals. In green is the white moderates, and that jumps from, in 2011, that jumps from a little under 20% to almost 45 or 50% there. And then in red is white conservatives, where it jumps from a low in 2010 or 2011, under 20%, and it kind of decreases off to about maybe 30% in 2020. And so this was Pew Research. This is a collaborative of Pew Research, Kaiser Family Foundation, and the Washington Post since 1995. See, there's something interesting here too, is you can see too, racism, based on these surveys, these 3 different surveys, it started to level off among all groups. White liberals, white moderates, and white conservatives, it started to level off as a problem in the United States, all these groups, until 2012, and then it took a major spike, like a major jump here on the right. It's kind of interesting. And so there's other graphs in here. I'll leave a link below for sure, but you can see same thing. It all starts in about 2012, 2013. I think I've made my point ad nauseum. So I'm going to show you just a few of the replies. So Patrick Bet-David said this, and if you haven't watched his podcast, it's fantastic. It's on Valuetainment channel. And he was a financial guy, but he kind of got into politics later, and he's actually a great interviewer. Patrick Bet-David says, what could have caused this? Who was president from 2009 to 2017? Well, it was Obama. And so ironic that they did this after decades of failed Middle Eastern wars, the 2008 mortgage crisis, and the Occupy Wall Street movement. Populism became so real, they went all in on dividing us. So in this cartoon right here, I really like this cartoon actually because it basically sums it up. So you can see, now something happened in 2012. See, we'd already gone through the 2008 housing crisis, and there was a lot of corruption on Wall Street on that. And a lot of people lost their homes too because they were pulled into these mortgages where they said, hey, you can have really, really bad credit and still get this $500,000 home, or you can have no credit at all. We won't even do a check, which I think was bait. I really do. At this point, I'm like, these things seem deliberate. And so lots of foreclosures. 2008, if you weren't around, hopefully I was around, and it was really devastating. It was horrible. And so with the mortgage crisis, the banks, of course, were going to collapse and fail, starting with Bear Stearns. So, of course, there was this emergency meeting, and the president and the incoming president, John McCain, and a couple other people, they got together and they got the Wall Street banks together, and they said, hey, what do we do? And the bank said, we need a bailout. We need government bailouts. So the government sponsored on behalf of us taxpayers, including people who lost their homes, we paid the government. We gave them, we had already been paying taxes. They used all our tax money to bail out the banks. But here's the thing, with all the law breaking that went on, not one person was arrested. As far as I know, I don't think anybody was arrested. Obama didn't arrest anybody. Nobody got arrested. Nobody got thrown in jail. There was no accountability. Hence, the Wall Street banks will continue down this road and continue to do worse, because this is the biggest problem nowadays, is just no accountability. Crimes go unpunished. That's like the norm. That's supposed to be the narrative right now. Not supposedly, it is happening. And so one thing that was going on in 2012, because now I'm asking, why did this happen? Why in 2012 did all this stuff happen? Well, Obama was president. Okay, and this is very much, I think, a part of it. And also, there was two groups that were actually starting to agree on things. Racism was going down. The effects of, the feelings of racism were going down. Things were feeling good between races. Not perfect. They never are perfect. But it was a little better. Okay, especially blacks and whites. It seemed to be just a little, it was leveling off, and also kind of just going away better, more than it had in the past. Those lines were dissolving. And I would say, I'm sure, I'm not speaking for everybody. It's just, these are my observations I've had just based on experience. So with this cartoon, I love this because they're showing that, hey, Occupy Wall Street was going on because 2008 housing crisis had happened already. And on top of that, so there was a lot of bitterness and anger in the United States, but it was all directed toward the bankers. Well, whenever this has happened in history, there's always been something where the bankers have jumped in, and it happened back in the early 1900s, where people were starting to get pissed off at big banks. They were feeling like, hey, these big banks are screwing us over. Well, they introduced the Federal Reserve Bank, and they sided with people. They had this campaign to side with people and make them feel like a wolf in sheep's clothing. The big banks were like, we're going to do this Federal Reserve Bank, which is only private. It's always only just been private. And we are going to control currency. We're going to be able to just print money whenever we want and make money whenever we want. And the people don't want this. So how do we get them to pass on this? Well, we make it seem like something that the United States government came up with. So they created a bill to pass the establishment of the Federal Reserve. Now, they call it the Federal Reserve to make it sound like a government organization. It's not. It's private. So anyway, every time there's been angst and people have started to recognize that the real problem is the banks, there has been something where they've established something to distract us and divide us against one another. So it's usually something based on immutable characteristics, black or white or whatever, and get us to fight again and fight each other and not turn our faces towards them and go, hey, you guys did this. You're in trouble. We know who you are. Well, this same thing started happening just before 2012. People were very resentful of what happened with the banks, and that the bankers were getting big bonuses and they were getting these golden parachutes, and people were like, wait, that's our taxpayer money. You just gave them a $10 million bonus, and right now the taxpayer's bailing you out. And this has always happened. So what happens right here in this cartoon? Introduce them to identity politics. Occupy Wall Street, generally more leftist people were doing that, like kids and young kids and stuff. They went down to Wall Street and they occupied it. They had tents and camps, and they planted themselves out, and they're like, stop corporate greed. You can see the signs. These were the signs, Occupy Wall Street. And they were fed up with it. Problem is, when people from either side start to have the same thoughts, that's when these people get nervous. Because the Tea Party came along, which is more right-wing for sure. And they were pissed off too. They're like, hey, the banks and Wall Street screwing us over. And they saw this and they were like, oh my gosh, the right and the left, these people who are usually opposed in a lot of ways, they're actually agreeing on something. We cannot have this. We cannot have this accountability. So we have to stir something up. So I like this. He's like basically calling Washington, D.C., saying, hey, I'm a banker. Introduce them to identity politics and start the culture wars. Okay. Now, there was one other thing that happened too in this time frame, which was a really boring bill. And nobody noticed because, of course, when you have an insidious bill, you name it really something either really great, like Build Back Better, which is not any of that. It's not building. It's the controlled demolition. And it's not better. Okay, it's worse. Or it has a name that's really boring. Well, I will tell you, there was an act in 2012 that was signed and passed, and it was at the behest of Obama, called the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012. That's the most boring thing I've ever heard of, right? So we're like, oh my gosh, that's like talking to me about how sewage utilities work, or how an electrical station works that provides power on a grid. I mean, it's just like, oh, okay. Well, that's what it's meant to do. That's the whole point of the title, is to get you to ignore it. So it was passed, and when everybody ignored it, this is actually a very crucial, important piece of legislation. The Smith-Mundt Act, I think it was written back in like the 1800s or something, but it allowed the U.S. to use misinformation and deception and mixed with propaganda to deceive their enemies, like especially in wartime. You know, we used the Enigma machine, like the Germans had this Enigma coding machine in World War II, and we wanted it. And I think we did get it, and we were able to use it, and it was used for deception because it was a coding machine, and you could use it to code and decode, I think. And so we tried to use it against the Germans to deceive them into thinking, hey, oh, we've got a bunch of Panzer tanks here, let's move them over here. Signed, the commander of blah, 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 and hopefully the Germans would fall for it. Well, it works a similar way, the Smith-Mundt Act. But the Smith-Mundt Act was okay. It was to be able to use against foreign adversaries and enemies, especially in times of war. Well, this was revised. That's why it's now called. It was revised from the Smith-Mundt Act of 18-something. Now it's revised as the Smith-Mundt Act, Modernization Act of 2012. So all it says now, adds a few words in there about, we will use this domestically if needed. Okay? So basically propaganda, deception, and misinformation, which we hear the term all the time, it comes from this ability, this way the government scoots by without being prosecuted, they used the backing of the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2012, backed by Obama, to deceive the American people. And so that gives them some legal grounds for being able to do it, even though it's absolutely 100% unethical. So I wanted to make those connections and kind of triangulate to me, kind of the three things that happened in 2012. Obama was president. Things changed drastically. And suddenly race relations just dissolved and eroded. Gender relations, gender wars, like with LGBTQ and transgender and stuff like that, that dissolved. And we're very, very, very polarized right now. And I don't like it. I hate it. But the thing that these metrics show us is that this is not organic. This was paid for and funded and fueled by the powers that be, these banks. This was funded. If you think the New York Times is just writing these articles just randomly because they think, well, this is a problem, we should address it. No, this is because this is being funded, okay? If you don't think this is being funded and there's a ton of money behind this, I would question your abilities to do critical analysis. And if you don't look at these charts and immediately, without even looking at the numbers, you can see the actual pattern of the graph is pretty much the same on every single chart. And so this wasn't inorganic. We can now see this was actually planned. And these culture wars were really stoked in 2012, 2013. So I just wanted to triangulate that issue, and that people were starting to come to an agreement about, hey, wait a second. The left, people on the left were like, these banks are super bad. We got to stop them. So we're going to protest. Tea Party would have protests too. They're like, hey, we got to stop these guys. They're on the right. They started to agree. And when you have the general populists start to agree, it must be demolished. Populism is the greatest fear of any political power. These people are scared of populism because, you know why? It's not the big deal. It's that they'll have to be accountable. That's really what it comes down to. And so, and they divide us along party lines too, but remember, they don't like any of us. So I just wanted a little reminder today, not necessarily a black pill, but kind of a revelation, and just something to equip yourself with as far as information that you can use. And hopefully, maybe you have family members, maybe you have somebody out there that you can help explain this stuff to, because this obviously isn't taught in schools. They don't want this taught in schools. And don't rely on Harvard or Princeton. These places are garbage now. We know that now. We're seeing that cheating is a thing. That's like endorsed at Harvard now. So they've lost their shine. In fact, they've fallen off their pedestal pretty far, and it's a huge precipice that they've fallen off. Anyway, that's for another day. Thanks for watching, folks, and I will talk to you later.